Good afternoon from Singapore and good morning to those joining us from Europe and other parts of the world. It's a real pleasure to welcome you to today's webinar, Peace in the Age of AI, From Principles to Practice, which we're jointly organising and co-hosting between the Centre for International Law at the National University of Singapore and CMI, Martti Ahtisaari Peace Foundation in Helsinki. My name is John Truby. I serve as the UNESCO Chair in Artificial Intelligence Law and Sustainability at the Centre for International Law, National University of Singapore. And I also chair the International Law Association Committee on AI and Technology Law. I'm so pleased that today's discussion brings together CIL, CMI, the UNESCO Chair, and the ILA Committee. We come to the subject of AI from different institutional positions, but with a shared concern. How can new technologies be used responsibly in areas where human judgment, trust, and legitimacy are most needed? So let me begin by thanking our colleagues at CMI for their partnership in shaping this webinar. I'd especially like to thank Mr. Michel Giovanardi, who is the Programme Officer for Digital Peacemaking at CMI, and he's a doctoral candidate at the United Nations University for Peace. So Michel will offer shortly some introductory remarks after this welcome, and then he'll help co-guide this discussion together with me during the moderated segment. So let me just briefly explain how this session will run. So after Michel's introductory remarks, we'll move into 4 short panel interventions. We've adjusted the speaking order, publicised slightly so that Dr. Samuel White will be the first speaker in the panel, and he'll speak on security, operational realities, and responsible AI in conflict settings. Samuel is a global fellow at CIL, and alongside his academic work, he served as an officer in the Royal Australian Infantry Corps and the Australian Army Legal Corps. So that combination of legal training and operational experience is particularly valuable for discussion on AI in conflict environments. And Samuel will be followed by Dr. Martin Wallich, who is an Associate Professor of Transformative Technologies, Innovation and Global Affairs at the University of Birmingham. So Martin will speak on AI, conflict, and international governance. His work brings together academic research and practical experience with the United Nations, including work on peace processes and political affairs. The third intervention will be from Ms. Johanna Puustainen, and forgive me for mispronouncing everybody's name, and she is the Head of Inclusion and Digital Innovation at CMI, and she's a professor in practice at Durham University Law School. So Johanna will speak on inclusion, digital innovation, and peace practice. And her experience in mediation, dialogue, design, and inclusive peace processes will help us keep the discussion close to the realities faced by practitioners. The fourth intervention will be from Dr. Raphael Dean Brown, who is a clinical associate professor at Qatar University College of Law, and he's co-rapporteur of the International Law Association Committee on AI and Technology Law. Raphael will address AI, peace processes, and legal practice, bringing a legal and regulatory perspective to questions of responsibility, governance, and the use of AI in public decision-making. So after these 4 interventions, we'll open the discussion across the panel and invite questions from across the audience. The Q&A segment is important because today's subject is still developing, and many of the most difficult questions arise when legal principles, field practice, and institutional constraints meet each other. If you do have a question, you can type the questions into the Q&A. So there's a button at the bottom of the Zoom screen, so you'll see that. And what we'll do is, after the 4 interventions, we'll select some of the questions. Hopefully we'll have time to get through them all. And I'm told you can also vote on, if you see a question you really like, you can vote on it. So perhaps we'll democratize the process. The title of today's webinar asks us to move from principles to practice. So that phrase is familiar in AI governance, but in peace and conflict settings, it carries real difficulty. We already have many principles. We speak about transparency, accountability, human oversight, fairness, inclusion, and responsibility. So these are useful starting points, yet they do not answer the practical question of what should be done in a fragile setting under pressure and with incomplete information. Peace processes are shaped by mistrust, trauma, political bargaining, and uncertainty. So, in that kind of environment, the use of AI raises questions that cannot be solved by technical competence alone. Who decides whether an AI tool is appropriate for mediation support or early warning? What kind of data can be used safely in a divided society? How should consent be understood when people are displaced or afraid to speak openly? What should a mediator do if an AI system produces an assessment that appears persuasive but is wrong? That's happened. AI can assist with information gathering, pattern recognition, scenario planning, and wider participation. It can help institutions see conflict dynamics more clearly, but at the same time, it can produce new risks. It may deepen surveillance, reproduce bias, expose sensitive communities to harm, or even give an impression of certainty where caution is required. So for law and governance, the task is therefore not to celebrate AI as a simple solution or to reject it as too dangerous to discuss. The harder task is to judge where AI can genuinely assist peace efforts, where it should be used and only with strong safeguards, and where it should not be used at all. So from the perspective of the UNESCO chair in AI law and sustainability, these questions go directly to human security, sustainability, and institutional responsibility. A system may be technically impressive, but that does not make it automatically suitable for a mediation room. Through the ILA Committee on AI and Technology Law, we are also examining how AI now affects public international law, peace and security, human rights, due diligence, accountability, and so on. And these areas can't be treated in isolation. Responsible AI in peace efforts requires legal reasoning, practical judgment, and awareness of context. I really hope today's webinar will help us think more about these questions. At its core, the discussion is not only about AI, it's about peace, responsibility, and human agency. Technology may change the tools available to mediators, diplomats, and international institutions, but it does not remove the need for judgment. In some settings, it makes that need even greater. I'm really grateful, truly grateful to all our speakers for joining us and to everybody attending today. And with that, I'm pleased to hand over to Michel for his introductory remarks. Thank you, Michel.
Hello, thank you, Dr. John Truby, for the kind words of introduction. And good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, wherever you are joining us from. Welcome to this webinar also from my side on peace in the age of AI, co-organized with the Center for International Law, the National University of Singapore, and CMI Marty Ahtisaari Peace Foundation. It's a real pleasure to open this session, and let me start with a few words on why we're doing this, why CMI is bringing this conversation together. CMI Marty Ahtisaari Peace Foundation, for those of you that are not familiar with our organization, is an independent Finnish foundation set up 25 years ago by President Marty Ahtisaari, Nobel Peace Laureate, and to help prevent and resolve violent conflict through dialogue and mediation. Today, we work across more than 20 countries, and we have contributed to peace processes in the Middle East and North Africa, Sub-Saharan Africa, Eurasia, Asia. And throughout those 25 years, we paid close attention to how technology and innovation can shape peace and conflict. What we call digital peacemaking and more recently AI for peace has consistently been a strategic priority for CMI work. So technology is rarely neutral in fragile contexts. It can make crisis worse through disinformation, polarization, surveillance, but it can also help prevent and resolve conflict by bringing in voices that would otherwise go unheard, by sharpening our analysis, but also by supporting mediators in the work they do every day. In recent years, we've been investing in our own methodologies and also in-house applications across different areas. The first is digital inclusion, opening up dialogue to communities that are politically or physically hard to reach. The second area of work at CMI is future-oriented dialogue and foresight, using technology to map perspectives and to support dynamics of workshops and mediation processes. And the third area of work for digital peacemaking is digital risk mitigation and mediation support. So our speakers will go more in depth. So I want to go ahead of them. I will leave the space for them to explain better what it is about. But I wanted to share a couple of words about this conversation and why this is timely at the moment. So a lot of work has already gone into setting out principles for the responsible use of AI, and a good number of them are thoughtful and well considered. But the other question, at least from our perspective, from our practical perspective, is how you actually put those principles into action, into practice, inside real processes, inside with real stakeholders and real risks and of course the real consequences you might have in a peace process. So it's against this backdrop that earlier this year, CMI launched its own principles for the responsible use of AI in peacemaking. And this initiative, you can find those principles on our website, of course. And this initiative has two aims. So first is to set out publicly the commitments that already guide the way we use AI in our mediation and dialogue work. And the second aim is to open a wider conversation with practitioners, governments, technology companies, and academic partners, a conversation on how we can innovate responsibly and concretely in this field. The principles that we have set out a number of commitments that, of course, sit at the heart of our work. I can mention some of them. I will not mention all of them, but of course, keeping people at the center of dialogue, making sure participation is inclusive, preserving the human judgment in any political decision-making process involving AI, and applying strong safeguards so that AI in peacemaking never contributes to surveillance, repression, escalation. And we also commit a lot to learning and refining and sharing our lessons learned across the field. That's something we do. But perhaps even more importantly, the core of this principles initiative, again, is that they are designed to drive action. So to spark this kind of practical work of turning the commitments into everyday practice. So this webinar is part of this wider conversation, but it's also a call to action, which we'll be carrying forward throughout the years, talking with different stakeholders and together, of course, with the Center for International Law at the National University of Singapore and other partners, with the aim to map out where the most pressing risks are and where, on the other hand, progress can be faster in applying AI and technology to peace processes. So I would like to thank you again for creating this space and for being with us today. And with no further ado, I would like to hand back the floor to Dr. John Truby to introduce the first speaker. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Michelle, and for joining us, I believe from Finland this morning. We appreciate that, and thank you for sharing the work of CMI. So now I'm very happy to hand over to Dr. Samuel White in Australia. Over to you, Samuel.
Great. Well, being the first one often means the tech problems come with me. So, can we confirm you should see a big bright yellow screen? Is that correct?
Correct.
Some nods. Wonderful. Great. Well, hello everyone. I'm Sam. I was at CIL until end of last year, and I've been retained on as a global fellow. And relevant for this, in my new position, I am a senior lecturer in military law and war studies, which are beautifully broad titles, which means we get to talk about all things AI, and it falls within the remit for the two. Now, I know John both personally and professionally, and I think I may have been put onto this panel on the premise of being the black sheep or the black hat, the person that says peace is impossible and it's good for business. And I don't fully subscribe to that perspective, but I do think it's important maybe that we see another side of it. I come from the premise, and this is the war studies side. I come from the premise that if you have a bigger shield, someone will make a bigger sword. And that tends to be the process of history. And the bigger sword results in the bigger shield. Now, what we find in cyberspace, though, and AI is a distinct part of cyberspace, but it is not all cyberspace. What we find in cyberspace is that the cost benefits have flipped. It used to be really costly to invade a country. It takes a lot of manpower, takes a lot of equipment, takes a lot of preparation. The ubiquity of cyberspace and the everyday nature of it means that you can have huge effects for a relatively low cost, right? That's the cyber domain generally. When we talk about artificial intelligence, I think it just furthers that divide. So realistically, there are some states and some corporations that are based in states that have a massive AI computing power. There are other states that don't, right? If we see this as almost an arms race, I think things start to make a bit more sense. Now, when we talk about autonomous, fully autonomous AI systems, we haven't hit that stage yet. What do I mean by fully autonomous? I mean in the aspect of, Terminator, killer robots, self-selecting targets. This seems to be the big thing that everyone's afraid of, lethal autonomous weapon systems. AI is kind of dumb at this stage, and I particularly like this aspect here of Marines outwitting an AI security camera by hiding in a cardboard box, right? We're at a moment in time technologically that it's still learning. If I give it 2 or 3 years, things will accelerate exponentially in terms of the computing power of AI. On the bottom right, you see there a Green Beret exploded his Tesla truck using AI to plan it. That is another side of AI, is that you can use it to create plans in a way that might flag on Google, right? There are ways that you can use AI to get around this notion of peace that we're discussing. One of the colleagues that we have at CIL, Elena, is very big on the idea of a right to peace, a positive right to peace under human rights law. That's one definition of peace. I probably come from the other perspective, which is peace is just the absence of war, and I'm sure I'll be eaten alive in the comments for that. But that's okay, because realistically, I might have a bigger stick, and that's the nature of history. Now, when we get into the deeper side of AI, peace, and conflict, we can't really go past Lavender. Lavender is a targeting software system that is public, and this is one of the difficulties in the peace and security space. What is public, what is not? Lavender is Israel's targeting system that it uses to identify potential Hamas members. You have no right of appeal from Lavender. If you are mistargeted, that is part of the very legal framework that exists around targeting. It's just that it is accelerating at a quicker and quicker speed. Now, when we talk about legal frameworks, I think as international lawyers, we have to deal with the elephant in the room. International law, as it currently exists, has lost a lot of public confidence. And I quite like this quote from The Guardian last year. International lawyers are divided over whether or not their discipline is alive and well, in hibernation, in its death throes, or is long deceased, a moral ghost that hovers over the map. International law is also frozen in two paradigms: peace and war, or armed conflict, as the Geneva Conventions talk about. When we talk about AI and peace, it doesn't bring with it, I mean, to me, it denotes specific legal frameworks that exist. In peace, you can breach sovereignty, human rights, the prohibition on non-intervention, use of force, armed attack, all of these big building blocks of public international law in peace. In armed conflict, the Geneva Conventions, Additional Protocol 1, customary international humanitarian law, these are the relevant legal frameworks. So I think as we move forward and as we're discussing AI in peace and in war, we need to have these paradigms in mind. Now, of course, the use of AI doesn't often fit neatly within these frameworks. People talk about hybrid threats, gray zone competitions, proxies. But the big question we have to ask ourselves is, when does it become armed conflict? And to that, we look at the definition of the ICRC, which is reflected in state practice and manuals, that it is a resort to armed force between the armed forces of a state. Now, out of interest, some people sometimes conflate laws of armed conflict and international humanitarian law. They argue perhaps that it's two separate bodies of law. I've always thought of it as the same thing under two words. You just show what school of thought you come from. The law of armed conflict is it's apology. It is a sorry, I can kill you under the law, but I don't want to. International humanitarian law is utopian. It's about protecting civilians from the risks and the consequences of AI. Which brings us to the punchy point that I wanted to talk about today, now that we've done all the legal framework and scene setting. Data poisoning. Data poisoning is a particularly interesting operation or a tactic, a technique or procedure, TTP. And it's where you insert maliciously or alter data into data sets that is training AI with the aim of altering their function or the ability of the algorithm. Think here about something that might redirect an autonomous weapon to shoot not you, because you've changed the code, but to shoot to the left or right. That's one example of data poisoning, but there are others. We can talk here of scenarios where you knowingly cause a targeting system to direct violence at someone else. You can talk about data poisoning where you make the targeting system just shoot anyone, or where it just becomes indiscriminate. Okay? These are all different scenarios that I think are at the friction point of international law currently with artificial intelligence. Many of the other things like Lavender, Israel's targeting system, Epic Fury, the basis for the United States intervention in Iran this year, these aren't brand new. These are logical progressions. Bigger stick, bigger sword. Oh, sorry, bigger sword, bigger shield. I find in the AI space, when we talk about peace and armed conflict, data poisoning is an area where there is no legal understanding. Because if it happens in peace, it's not regulated by the Geneva Conventions. If it happens in armed conflict, it's often too late. Now, I might leave there, John, and hand back, and look forward to taking questions later.
Thank you, Sam. Super interesting. I'm sure that'll result in a number of questions. And yeah, really, really glad for that and for you joining us from Australia. Next, we're actually going across the world to the UK Midlands, to the University of Birmingham to hear from our next speaker, Dr. Martin. So, Dr. Martin, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Let me get the technology going. Great. I hope you see the screen. Look, we just heard from Sam about bigger swords leading to bigger shields, and what we're interested in at CMI, but also in the larger peace community, is about how can we get larger negotiation tables, right? How do we get greater interaction between conflict parties? How do we create more opportunities to understand each other, to avoid that we have to buy bigger swords, bigger gadgets, but rather spend the money for human development. And in my intervention, I'm going to reflect a bit about how AI, conflict, and international governance fits together. I'm going to say a few words about concrete initiatives, both from CMI but also other peace actors, and then invite you to think together about kind of what are the questions I think we need to ask when we look at this heavily tech entrenched reality that we are living in. Now, let me first add to the diagnostic that Sam started, which really kind of has to do with this profoundly changing conflict landscapes, right? We have more pressure points. Think about the climate crisis, and we're really muddling through this mix between real conflict theaters, and Sam just gave you kind of the ideal legal rundown of that. IHL on one side, use of force on the other side, but then the reality is that we live in this poly crisis, and I think the war in Iran, demonstrates this very neatly, where a conflict happening far away, that will have an impact on us wherever you are in the world, one way or the other, and technology is adding to this blurring conflict landscape because more than ever now it entrenches all parts of our lives. And I think that's why it is important to both think about the risk, but also the opportunities technology creates for peace processes. Now, what adds to this blurriness is really that artificial intelligence appears both in military and civilian parts of our life. And that has been very different in the past. You can't really, have a tank in your backyard. I know there are some kind of collect tanks, but a usual military equipment would be very distinct, right? And certain kind of, arms, equipment, would be very distinct. Nowadays, we live in this time where tech is really blurring the lines of military and civilian realities. Take here an example of a robot dog that on one side can be used as an attack force, but on the other side, for reconstruction and demining purposes. And this plays out in many regards with regard to how data is used. On one side for surveillance, but on the other side maybe for ceasefire monitoring. On one side to get an idea of kind of what your adversary thinks, on the other side to get a sense for what the public thinks, to make a peace process more inclusive. And this makes it really, really difficult, but also extremely exciting, because we live in this time of co-evolution of war and peace tech that is mutually kind of enriching. Now, all this is happening against the reality of what I call the AI turn, right? Where we are moving away from pure data collection to opportunities for greater pattern recognition, where we move away from just conflict monitoring to greater anticipation and foresight opportunities. And this feels like a kind of and kind of never-ending cycle where we're kind of, again, going back to the sword and the shield, we'll kind of get better, and we'll have more sophisticated ways of killing each other, but also at the same time we're coming better in kind of providing humanitarian response and trying to overcome those differences. And technology has been always a great accelerator in the past, and now, given that AI is really entrenching all parts of it, the challenges and the opportunities that are even greater. Now, let's talk for a moment also about a new generation of transformative technologies, because we can't really just look at AI in isolation. We really see a full stack of transformative technologies. So when I talk about transformative technologies, I'm talking about technologies that are really shifting power that are really shifting how societies interact, right? And there are a few frontiers at the horizon. Some of them already feel outdated, like intuitive interactions, where the blurriness between human and machine becomes even greater, because we wouldn't really know anymore whether we are talking to a robot soldier or robot peacemaker or a real person. We'll have new opportunities with regard to virtual worlds, immersiveness, that again blur the lines between what's real and what's unreal. Technology is increasingly integrated into our attire, what we wear, and becomes an extension of our body. And we see an increasing trend of digital twins, not just to replicate kind of conversations with loved ones that we might have lost, but also to simulate what our adversary might think or what a peace population might say to a certain peace proposal. So again, kind of this odd catch up both on the military and on the civilian side. Now, on the research side, we just see a lot of question marks. We've seen recent research pointing to preferences to have machine-assisted conversations. Think about kind of, the way of how much easier maybe a chatbot conversation is with a customer representative instead of trying to convince a human, or the other way around. So there are certain preferences, and research really puts a lot of question marks behind how the uptake of technology is perceived across societies. Now, 3 examples here, both from the CMI side, but also from the peace building community at large, of how technology is used in peace processes. One heavy focus we have at CMI, but this kind of community is ever growing, is around deliberative technology. So how can we really harvest the scale of service and polls, the flexibility and intimacy you have in focus groups, but also the dynamics you have in a dialogue forum through digital dialogue. So ways where you can listen to people's voices at scale to get a sense for preferences in order to shape peace agreements that are more lasting, right? That are not just in the hand of a few that are sitting around the table, but really responding to the needs and demands of the public in large, given that this is an important factor to forge sustainable agreements that last before we'll see a return kind of to violence, and give us an opportunity to really build on this in more resilient societies. Second example is around virtual reality. We've really seen kind of plethora of new applications that allow to walk each other's journey. The picture you see on the left or on the right with the gentleman in a black suit is taking the Security Council, where VR was used to brief decision makers. And virtual spaces are really this opportunity to walk each other's journey in an immersive environment. A third example is around strategic foresight and data-driven foresight, a field that CMI supports around the world. And here, digital twin simulations give you a chance for better understanding what certain preferences are. And let me conclude with a few open questions I think we need to pay attention to. One is really that when we just heard this from Sam, that we constantly talk about kind of the human needs to be kept in the loop. And I think this is a false promise, because in practice, we are already losing the human in the loop. AI systems move faster, they become more complex and harder to meaningfully question and override. And humans often, shift away now from being decision makers to just becoming validators of system outputs. And peace processes that really creates real risks for trust, accountability, and judgment. A second open question, I think, really spins around behavioral science and human response. Like, we know far too little about how people respond to those technologies. Do AI systems really build trust, or do they create greater dependencies? Do digital dialogues widen participation or indirectly distort perceptions? And those are all not technical questions. They are questions about behavior, power, legitimacy, and trust. And lastly, responsible peace tech. Michele just mentioned the CMI principle that got launched at the India Impact Summit, and they are really an invitation, right? Not like a prescription, but more an invitation to have a conversation about responsible use of technology in peace processes. So finally, I think we need to talk more about are we just automating away, and how are we outsourcing judgment, and why? and how to maintain, lastly, kind of human gut feeling, emotional awareness, human-to-human dialogue in this very tech-entrenched world that we live in. I look forward to the discussion, and thanks so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Martin. It's super interesting. I'll remind everyone at the bottom of the screen, you'll see a Q&A. There's a question mark in the middle of a little speech bubble. If you want to type anything as we go along, we won't look at the Q&A until after all of the panel speakers have completed, but you're welcome to type whenever you think of a question. Otherwise, you can leave it to later. So next, we're moving to Miss Johanna Pointanen. Please forgive me for mispronouncing your name. And I believe you're in Durham, in the north of England. So a different part of the UK. So Johanna, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and really good afternoon, everyone. It's really a pleasure for CMI to be co-organizing this webinar with the Center for International Law and the National University of Singapore, and also to be on this panel with very distinguished experts. So let me continue actually on this kind of contradiction that previous speakers already highlighted. On one hand, that we see how AI and digital technologies are transforming warfare. We know in practice how they're amplifying polarizations online, fragmenting societies. But as also Martin alluded to, we know that these same technologies can also open new possibilities for analysis and for understanding deliberative technology. And peace mediation does sit right in the middle of this tension. So the discussions, no surprise, are very binary, that AI is either something that will revolutionize mediation or something that automatically kind of undermines the human element in that. From CMI's perspective, I think the most useful question for us is, and how and under what conditions can AI support more inclusive, more informed, and more responsive peace practice, while also avoiding these new forms of exclusion and harm? So I will focus in my remarks, particularly the role of AI in advancing inclusion in peace processes. So what does digital inclusion actually mean? How does AI add value to that? Share a couple of practical examples, highlight a few key risks, but also, not least, what does responsible practice look like in real terms? So what do we mean by digital inclusion in mediation? At its core, it's the strategic use of digital technologies to enable and expand the meaningful participation of diverse stakeholders in peace processes. Most important starting point is that the innovation is only useful if it's really grounded in the needs of the process. You know, what is the purpose of inclusion? Who are we including? On what? Whom? For what purpose? And so that we cannot start with the technology, but rather the people and the political realities of the process. Then this may seem obvious, but I think in the current AI hype, it sometimes feels like a radical position that we don't start with the technology, but really start with the needs of the process. The AI's main contribution to this is to help mediators and also other conflict stakeholders to process, analyze, and make sense of complex information. One of the most long-standing practical challenges to inclusive mediation is that more people and stakeholders you include, the harder it becomes to systematically listen to, make sense of the information and all the perspectives that are being shared. And this is where AI can really offer added value. I mean, you can collect hundreds and thousands of consultation inputs at scale. You can analyze, detect patterns, trends, shifts in narratives, also on information that is found online. You can cluster themes. You can also do multilingual translation and transcription. So really to synthesize large volumes of qualitative data into something that is more accessible for both mediation teams, but also decision makers. So to put it simply, it's to strengthen our ability to listen at scale in mediation processes. So let me give you a couple of very concrete examples to illustrate this. For instance, in Yemen last year, we were working with the political parties and movements and local partners in a dialogue process where they decided that there was a need to really conduct youth networks across the country to understand their interests, their needs, perspectives on the topics that were being discussed. So we used the WhatsApp-based engagement and also combined with an AI-supported sense-making tools to inform this broader political party dialogue process. So first, young people could contribute through voice notes, not only like just simple surveys, but also voice notes or text messages, including in Yemeni Arabic. And then there was an AI layer that helped to analyze what were the recurring themes, concerns, priorities emerging across hundreds and thousands of these qualitative contributions. And then these inputs were shared to political leadership to inform the national vision they were preparing. And as like one of the young participants later told us, that it was one of the first times, or for them it was the first time, they were able to contribute to a political discussion without going through to the traditional gatekeepers. And I think that what captures something important, that the value is not technological, but can be political. So it was about creating these additional pathways for participation and help to bring forward perspectives that are often absent from elite political conversations. And the second example comes from Sudan, where we've used an AI-enabled dialogue platform called Remesh to support collective sense-making among women's groups amid large-scale displacement. So the platform allowed hundreds of participants to respond to open-ended questions, do that online, while AI is instantly clustering and synthesizing the input into key themes, and then participants could react to and prioritize each other's ideas. So it wasn't so much about the individual inputs, but an actual collective conversation. And a time when the physical coming together in person wasn't possible, it enabled dialogue, continued dialogue among them to, identify shared priorities, prioritize joint action. So it really is, in this case, it was conflict stakeholders listening to one another. So the value of AI potentially is to enable this listening at scale, process this complexity, and then engage broader constituency that traditional formats would allow. But there are, of course, risks that I don't want to undermine. We cannot romanticize digital inclusion. I think technology, we all know, can reproduce exclusion and also create entirely new risks. The main challenge is, of course, unequal access. We know globally that there are 280 million fewer women than men online. There are questions around digital literacy, affordability, language barriers. All these are shaping who can participate, how they can contribute. AI systems themselves are not neutral. They reflect the assumptions, biases embedded in the data and the design. And of course, if we're not careful, AI can amplify these existing inequalities rather than challenge them. Another real concern is superficial inclusion. Simply collecting digital inputs does not automatically create political influence or meaningful participation. We know many communities affected by conflict are already heavily consulted. It's not always that it's the lack of data, but it's the lack of political willingness to listen that is the problem. So that's a real concern. Of course, security and privacy are fundamental concerns. We need to think about privacy preserving data practices, about collecting as little personal information as possible, anonymizing sensitive data, securely storing information, also clearly informing participants how their data will use. There's the growing problem of technology-facilitated violence, especially against women. Among, let's say, women journalists and activists, some surveys suggest as high as 3/4, 73% are experiencing online violence. So we need to think about, especially on digital participation, who faces risks by participation, who is self-censoring, and so on. So what does good practice look like? First, it really is about the design. So it's first about what's the ultimate purpose for why you're doing this, finding the tools that fit the context, starting where people are already at, and digital platforms, digital literacy, cultural norms. And also, second, we find that hybrid approach is often essential. So online engagement, for instance, is not to replace, it's rather to complement the in-person relationship building and trust building. And third, of course, meaningful human oversight across all analysis to interpret the political realities and make judgment calls. And finally, transparency matters. People need to be very clear about what the technology is doing, how the information is being used, and what realistically the influence participation may have. So let me conclude by some final reflections. I think in theory, AI can help us listen better, broaden participation, understand voices that are otherwise excluded in mediation, and then it has real value. But also technology is not clearly neutral and inclusion is never automatic. So digital tools may expand participation and strengthen listening, but I think no AI tool has yet solved the hardest challenge in mediation, which is to build the political will for inclusion and for peace. So thank you very much. I really look forward to also audience questions and interaction later on.
Thank you, Professor Johanna, and some really actually alarming statistics that you shared with us, about gender-based violence and so on. That I'm sure we can discuss more during the Q&A. So, yeah, wow, super interesting. Our final panelist, our final intervention is with Dr. Raphael Dean Brown, who, as I mentioned, is co-rapporteur of the International Law Association and very highly published author and global expert on AI. So Dr. Raphael, over to you. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Dr. John, and thank you for inviting me to join this esteemed panel. My talk will be closer to what Joanna was talking about. I will be talking about AI monitoring and verification of peace and ceasefire using the Colombia mediation here in Doha that I was a part of as a case study. So my talk will be divided into 3 parts. First, I want to explain the Colombia case study. Second, I will talk about the potential use of AI tech in peace monitoring and verification. And then I want to leave, most importantly, with the general principles for use of AI in monitoring and verification that I've come to like put together myself. First, as background, I was some legal advisor and mediator, part of the Qatari host delegation in a mediation consisting of 2 working sessions here in Qatar for the demobilization of a group called self-proclaimed AEGC, Autodefensas Ejército Gaitanista de Colombia, commonly known as the Clan de Golfo. And the AGC, as background, is the largest armed group in Latin America, certainly in Colombia, with about 8,000 to 10,000 fighters on their roster. This mediation process here in Doha led to the commitments to peace that was signed here in Doha in December 2025. Sweden, Spain, and Norway joined us on the second working group of that, and they acted as mediators as well. Unfortunately, this peace process was cut short before we even went into monitoring and implementation, primarily for 2 reasons. Number one, the US put a lot of pressure, as they did with other countries. They put a lot of pressure on the Colombian government to arrest drug smuggling organizations, to be harsher on them. Second, the US designated the AEGC as a terrorist organization. I incidentally had to withdraw my participation from the peace process because of my US citizenship. So just to be clear, peace monitoring and verification was not fully agreed to or discussed in this process. However, it was agreed that the OAS, MAP OAS, would lead the monitoring and verification in conjunction with other stakeholders in Colombia. So at the end of this process, I started thinking about how AI could be used in the context of monitoring and verification in what OAS was doing. My interest in this is because of my scholarship in AI. Before I could explain this, it's also important to kind of explain the Zoot in the Paz Total policy in Colombia. The Paz Total basically is an expansion of the peace process in Colombia that was well known from the 2016 FARC agreement. They wanted to expand the scope of that process to include both political and non-political groups. And the group that I was involved in the mediation is a non-political group. It's an armed group, and it's considered not political because it was engaged in drug trafficking and other types of illegal activities that the government basically alleged that they're engaged in, and well documented as well in newspapers and government reports throughout Colombia. So an important component of the Paz Total policy of Colombia is, and also even it existed prior to Paz Total, is the concept of the ZUT, Zona de Ubicación Temporal. So the ZUT is basically serves as a safe transitional space for armed fighters to disarm and demobilize and transition to civilian life. So in the commitments to peace in Doha that was signed in December 2025, the parties essentially agreed to create ZUTs in 14 municipalities throughout Colombia. So it's important to understand that this process of getting the fighters into the ZUT is a complicated one. There's a transition process of putting the fighters inside the ZUT and then transitioning them into civilian life. There's a lot of challenges here for monitoring and verification that potentially AI could kind of help alleviate. This includes the geographic scope of where the fighters are located, the locations of the ZUTs throughout Colombia, which is in 14 different municipalities, 4 pilot ones, the number of combatants being 10,000, including their families, just monitoring them, but most importantly, the ability of external forces, other armed groups in Colombia. There's a lot of armed groups in Colombia. At the time that we were doing our mediation, there were 13 other mediations with other armed groups ongoing in Colombia. And it's possible for these armed groups to then retake territories that the AAGC, for example, would have left. So one of the questions that I had was, how could AI be used, in this context to kind of enhance monitoring and verification of the peace process? And there's not really a case study that where this has been done. The closest we have is what happened in Donbass, where they used it's probably the most tech-savvy monitoring that happened. And as you know, the Ukraine war happened nevertheless. So technology does not give you all of the answers. But there are some things that it can offer. For example, I thought of 5 things, for example, that could be used that's AI-driven. That could be enhancing CCTV. This is privacy intrusive, but it can identify patterns like the presence of weapons and help monitoring in that way. Satellite monitoring as well could be used. There's already companies like Hala Systems that have been deployed in Yemen and Syria. These satellite monitoring systems basically enable alert systems for civilians and provide real-time situational awareness of any potential violations of the peace process. Drone-based monitoring have been used, of course, in previous peace agreements monitoring, including in Ukraine, in the Donbass. So they can patrol in terrains that are difficult for human monitors to go into, putting less risks to the human monitors like OAS in the EAGC peace process. So the first 3 are really just monitoring of what's going on in the peace process, but there's also other uses of AI, like the use of natural language processing to process data and news to identify fake news. One of the biggest obstacles to a successful peace process is misinformation campaigns, fake news that go out, and it really derails the peace process. A lot of that stuff happened even during the mediation. And so we imagine that could happen as well in the monitoring and verification phase of the peace process. And the last type of tech that could be used is AI data infusion, which could actually allow an AI to predict violations of the agreement before they even occur. So a prediction ability to be able to identify hotspots for potential violations. The last part of my talk is to cover some general principles that I thought of that's really important in order to really implement the use of AI in verification and monitoring. One is human oversight, and I've heard some of the colleagues here talk about this. This is really an institutional challenge. It comes from designing the process from the beginning, not only verifying the data and the actual use of AI, but even in the design phase. That's when the challenge begins. There has to be continuous training, and most importantly, having budget for actually people to do the human oversight. In the Donbass, but by the end of the monitoring there, they actually only had one person monitoring it. And in the end, by the time the war started, he just basically left. And nobody knows what happened to the monitoring of the technology of that. The second thing is transparency and explainability. This goes to the black box problem of AI. What happens if an AI flags a violation of the peace process agreement? This could cause a problem if one of the parties, for example, asks for an explanation. So there has to be clear documentation, trails, and independent verifications. It's verification by of the AI by those in charge of the monitoring and verification, like OAS here in the Colombian process case study, for example. Another one is proportionality and necessity. It's a very important principle. There's a need to balance both security, monitoring, and verification with the privacy and the dignity of the individuals inside the ZOOT. So in the Colombia case study, for example, you would have the families of the fighters also inside the ZOOT. So if you have CCTV cameras on them and AI satellite on them, there's a lot of privacy issues there, and that would not necessarily make them feel comfortable, and that could likely lead to more or to a breakdown of the peace process itself. Data sovereignty is another important principle to keep in mind. If you're using like HALA systems or some Palantir, if they were to transition to peace process, Palantir, of course, is now primarily on military. Then there's a question of the data of the peace process, the national sovereignty, for example, of Colombia to own that data. And of course, even questions of national security, because the ZOOT itself could be surrounded by military. There are military operations to try to enforce the peace process. And that could create a national security issue if the data is actually controlled and stored outside of Colombia. And finally, there's an issue of accountability and redress that some of my colleagues mentioned earlier. There has to be an ability to challenge errors made by AI. If AI hallucinates, if there's issues of bias and neutrality in the AI, you have to allow the parties to basically challenge that, to have remedies and ability to redress those mistakes. And that really leads to the question of who's accountable for these AI errors. How can they be addressed? And that requires a really good governance of the peace process, monitoring and verification portion of the peace process. In our peace process with EIGC, the design was to have OAS actually be on the ground because of their experience with monitoring. Their experience cannot be replaced by AI. That's another thing that's really important to stress. Their ability to build relationships in the community, to really look at the person level, what's going on in the community especially as they transition into the ZOOT. That cannot be replaced really by actual people on the ground, on jeeps and actually talking to people. Thank you very much, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Apologies again for the tech challenge there.
Thank you, Dr. Raphael. And so interesting to hear about a live case happening at present, and then the potential use of AI within that. Some really topical points to uncover. Thank you. So now I invite Michelle to join me to moderate the panel. We can ask some questions, and before going to the Q&A, remember, if anybody has a question, please put it in the Q&A at the bottom of the Zoom screen where the question mark is, and we will hopefully come to all of the questions. Michelle, I will, if you have questions first, I'd love to hear them. I think that would be the most appropriate. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Such a rich and interesting conversation, also with different perspectives, backgrounds, use cases from different regions. So thank you so much again to the speakers for this very interesting panel. I think there were like 2 or 3 things that resonated. I'm not sure who to address these questions to, but I think one thing that featured highly is this idea of political action, or if you will, political inaction. So technology is there to support, but what concretely can be done to make sure we don't end up in practices of data extractivism or data fatigue, and how do we make this possible as a political tool? I heard also about some ideas of early warning forecasting, and how I also wanted to ask maybe Raphael, if what kind of data were these models built upon, and if you found any usefulness in those predictions and how to translate them into actions, political action. And then I think one missing maybe actor that was not mentioned so much is tech companies. So of course they have an agency, and increasingly so, and contexts where the legal frameworks and rule of law might be in jeopardy, especially in conflict settings. So there's nobody actually to enforce rules and frameworks and laws, or the judicial system is not there actually to fulfill its promise. So in those contexts, still some companies are operating and shaping conflict dynamics. So what's the role of tech companies as actors, and how could they like be involved more in this conversation? And lastly, also to resonate some of the questions I've seen in the Q&A, there's a point about transparency and accountability with AI. There was a question in the Q&A we can maybe address more in length, but it's around responsibility. So who's responsible if something goes wrong? And this was mentioned also by the last panelist. So what's the cycle there? The cycle of the AI life cycle, digital life cycle. Who's responsible to ensure those principles are actually applied, or if something goes wrong, who's then accountable? We heard about accountability, but how can this be shaped in practice in places where, again, the judicial system might not be so strong, or it's like being rebuilt step by step? So a few questions. I will leave the panelists. Yeah, they're free to answer. I don't want to address it to one panelist specifically, but feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so let's take those first questions, and then we can move on if there's more afterwards. Samuel has a childcare emergency, so he's left now. So would anybody like to volunteer
Yeah,
to?
so I guess I could go first because my name was mentioned specifically. Very good questions, Michelle. So the first question was about satellite monitoring, I believe, and what kind of things could be seen from this. I don't know if I mentioned this when I was speaking, but for example, they use satellite monitoring for an alert system for civilians. They can see before there's any, for example, violence, and they can move civilians out of the way. And that has actually saved some lives in places like Yemen and Syria. And this kind of connects with your second question as well. But there are other uses for satellite monitoring, especially in tough terrains. You can see like any movements of fighters, in the area, any movements of third parties who could actually start kind of like violence with the group that's being protected. And then it leads to your second question of the AI companies, when it comes to monitoring and verification, HALA system is one of the most well-known, but Palantir also is engaged in military kind of monitoring, especially with satellites. And it's important to really make sure that they don't control all of the data and all of the processes, that whoever is using AI for either monitoring, verification, or any other uses in peace process has to make sure that there's some sort of a local AI, and we don't depend only on tech companies for creating the AI and for storing the data. And to the third question with regards to accountability, again, in our peace process with the EIGC, there was actually a discussion to have the OAS monitor the ground, but the mediators themselves could still kind of review, that monitoring and review what was going on. And different peace processes have different ways to do this, but I agree it's important to kind of design into the system a way to address any concerns about the AI and how the AI is to be used. Unfortunately, international law is silent on this. A lot of the verification and monitoring of a peace process is really left to the parties. And I think international law should have a say in how AI is used in this process. Thank you.
Would anybody else like to answer, or would you, Johanna?
Yeah, I can. I see also another important question about coming on the cases in Yemen and Sudan. But first, just on responsibility, just to highlight, at least from CMI's perspective, if we are using a particular digital approach in the dialogue and mediation work, we are definitely feeling and owning the responsibility of do no harm in that regard. Having said that, I think that there's a longer term effort that should be made around a broader conversation with national governments, with tech companies, so that there are more stricter guardrails put into what type of technology is developed, what are its implications for peace and security, that there are global governance frameworks that are actually addressing some of the clear harms, particularly in conflict space that we're seeing. But I think when it comes to, for the time being, we see that our responsibility is with the user. And there's some of the safeguards you can put in place is some already that I mentioned in terms of, for instance, I think there needs to be a disconnect between the input and the personal identity very early on in the process, thinking about really how the data is stored, what is its life cycle, being also transparent about it and about those practices to the stakeholders first and foremost. But I'd also want to return to this question about the practical cases that I mentioned in Yemen and Sudan, and in terms of how participation looked in terms of number of participants and also how to mobilize people to join deliberative tech conversation, because I think those are really important questions. First, on the numbers. So in our case, these were pilots that were very much heavily dependent on the qualitative input. So we were not aiming for high numbers. They were in both, between 100 and 200 individuals that were joined. But I think importantly, in terms of diversity, in terms of gender across all governorates in the case of Yemen, and in the case of Sudan, that they were in different locations and from different women's constituencies. So it was more about not necessarily higher numbers, but more about the quality of input and the length of the conversation, as highlighted that this is something that AI really provides new types of opportunities for. Having said that, I think that there's really interesting cases of peers working on using deliberative tech in the context of conversations about peace that are reaching even much, much higher numbers. So I think this really is a space that is developing fast, and I think even while these are early pilots, I think in the field are showing greater potential. In terms of communications, I shared some of that in the remark, but I think this is actually essential, and it's something that we don't often talk enough about. We think to set up a consultation, And that's kind of it, but really is the preparatory work that goes into it. In both of these cases, for instance, there was actually a personal engagement with the organizers and the facilitators and the participants in advance, because it was also about this responsibility, so that the stakeholders are really clear what they're taking part in, who is organizing this in the environment of high mistrust. There often is a conversation that needs to happen rather than just an email that comes from an anonymous source. So, for instance, in Yemen, it was, as we did it with the political parties, it was the political party cadres themselves from their own party that were introducing the initiative to the young youth participants, saying, like, this is what this is about. If you have any question, this is who CMI is. This indeed what happens. And of course, also having a debriefing afterwards, that there's communication, again, not to be extractive, that you just kind of get inputs and who knows what happens to the inputs, but you also reporting back to the stakeholders, this is what came about, do you validate this? So, inclusive in terms of process of analysis, and then also outcomes that I think many times in mediation processes, it's a tall order to promise that somebody's inputs will really shape the final outcome, and we need to be very careful about managing that expectation. And so, for instance, in the consultations or dialogues we've organized, we've built in elements that we can respond to, like, for instance, in the case of Sudan, some of the women's participants were highlighting the need for mental health and psychosocial support alongside more these political opinions on the longer term needs. So we could respond to that practical need immediately with our partners. And we thought that that was really important for this accountability. Sorry if I was too long, but they're really, really great questions. Over to others.
No, really interested. Sorry, before we move on to that, can you explain sort of practically how it worked for people in Yemen, and how they actually, what tool did you give them, and what did they actually do with it, just so that everyone has a practical understanding of it?
Clear, yeah. Great. So first, maybe starting even one level up, that we together with the parties kind of looked at the questions that we wanted to ask. So in terms of what are the needs of the process, again, like what are the themes, questions that really would seek their inputs for. And then it was first thing, we used WhatsApp because there was this sense that is quite an accessible tool for the target group we were trying to reach. And then it was through WhatsApp, they would get a notification. There were a couple of survey questions first, and then questions that they could either type in as answers or give voice messages about, where they see the most urgent needs in terms of the political process to address, what are the most, most unaddressed areas for reconciliation, for instance. And the important was that they could answer in Yemeni Arabic. So, and then all that data was gathered. We used that translated into English, but then we did that so that we, as a human oversight throughout the process, so we could check that also, for instance, that the translation was correct. So, there were colleagues went through that partially manually to make sure that there was nothing lost in the process or nothing added. And they're also disconnecting those inputs from identities, but then also keeping them numbered. Because in the following phase, we used Talk to the City, which is an open source AI analysis tools that started to first synthesize all of these inputs, cluster them into specific themes, start to see, detect some of the areas of agreement, disagreement in terms of the statements that were made. And there again, transparency was extremely important, because the tool is such that whenever, let's say, it proposes there is an clear disagreement on these issues, it refers to the very concrete inputs among the data collected. So this is what was said, participant 1 or participant 73. So you can again double check that the analysis that is coming forward is actually sensible and is really rooted into the data that was provided to it. So hopefully that clarifies a bit of the process. And then the inputs were both taken back to the youth, but then also to the political party leadership to inform their conversation.
So very practical, and I presume because you are allowing voice answers in local dialect, you may have. Did you find you had a higher rate of submissions than if you'd demanded written answers?
Absolutely. And that was the interesting part. It was a nearly 100% of those who started the consultation that concluded it, which is really very, very quite rare in these type of consultations. And also that it was the nature of the ability to kind of answer in voice message that gave much more detail and nuance to the contributions that at least our experience that you would be able to get with a simple survey and so on. And again, I mean, we would have, without AI, it would have been impossible to actually do something with this data because no human labor required to go through that would have been quite tremendous.
And sorry, before we go to Dr. Martin, Dr. Raphael, do you think that kind of tool might have been useful in the Colombia case? Sorry to put you on the spot there. Do you think that could have practical application?
Yeah, good question. Each peace process is different, and in the Colombia mediation, inserting AI into the discussion at the very beginning of the mediation would have probably derailed the whole process. So you wanted to start with like bigger issues, that they had, and not get into monitoring and verification right away. You wanted to get and talk about monitoring and verification later on. You first want to get them to agree into like what are the ZOOTs. First of all, you get them to agree to the actual demobilization, and then get them to agree to actually identifying the ZOOTs themselves. So that's why we couldn't even get to the monitoring and verification and discussion in that process, because there were so many other things that were, if those were not addressed, you couldn't even get to an agreement that you could monitor. So it's interesting how like perhaps you can incorporate AI at the design of the process early on, but probably only in certain aspects of the process. Like in what Joanna was talking about, that's possible with regards to kind of like figuring out what to talk about in the process. But for my discussion, using AI in monitoring and verification, you couldn't insert that at all into it, which means you couldn't even start talking about designing this AI until after you're in the monitoring and verification stage. And you'd have, and I agree with what was said about getting the government involved, getting other people involved, in actually designing an AI that would help in, for example, the monitoring and verification. So it's not the same for all these processes.
Thank you. And Michelle, you have some questions now, I think also for Dr. Martin.
Yeah, I mean, Dr. Martin, feel free to touch upon the other questions and then the tech companies' questions, but maybe let me add also one questions I've seen in the chat to those questions, which is around AI arms race. So one of our participants asking about the AI race and how this is playing out in peace and conflict dynamics. Do we have to adapt to US and China leading this space? There's like more space for also other players to be part of the conversation, or is more AI development needed to address global challenges, and what is the model? It's like two main players in a race, or is there space for more innovation across, and how does this look in practice with respect to the private companies and so forth? Does it make sense to talk of a race as well after all? So over to you.
Yeah, no, thank you. And technology has been always divided just between a few, right? I mean, we only have a handful of arms manufacturers around the world. We only have a few that can kind of produce certain types of medication, right? So this is not unusual, right? That we see polarization. I think what's interesting here is that this is heavily concentrated with a focus on two actors in particular, but And here comes my point. As consumers, we have choice power. We can choose which companies we give our money to, right? Whenever I hear that, the peace community should develop its own artificial intelligence, I would say good luck, because the resources wouldn't really exist. Where we can't kind of, create foundational models from scratch, but we can check whether LLMs have a certain elasticity, right, to be useful in conflict settings. To give you an example, a project I'm running with colleagues at the Doha Institute in Qatar looks at different LLMs and to what extent so large language models, right? Like, we use them through the interface of chatbots. To what extent are they useful to solve conflict? And we'll get a sense for this by testing out different personas, different stances we take, and provoking those chatbots to see whether they are just pleasing us, like a good customer service representative, right? Or whether they can also hold a dissonance, which you need in peace processes where it's not about neutrality, but the ability to be all party-sided and to balance out imbalances, right? Our investigation here looks at the ability of foundational LLMs to bounce back, basically, right? Because then they are a good foundational starting point to build mediation and negotiation applications on top of them. Now, the problem with the big tech companies is that the peace building economy is far too small in comparison to the war economy and the industrial complex of kind of the arms industry. But again, we have choices. Maybe some of you out there have changed your subscription from ChatGPT to Anthropic's Claude because of what you saw in the news, whether that actually is resulting in real changes, who knows, and whether that was just a media stunt from one company against the other, who knows, but you have choices, right? We have choices to build application on top of the other. One thing that I think I'm passionate about is to be really mindful with regard to the design process. And Johanna just spoke about kind of the fact that we can't really fix a bad political process with a good technology. That's this illusion that we currently see. Well, if we just had a chatbot or an AI application that could help us bring different sides together, but if there's no process in place, very hard to ask people to come to the table. If the frictions are so large or the political appetite to make use of those opinions too little. And there are real also, and I wanted to put a pin on that, there are real challenges, right? When we talk about deliberation processes and so-called simple surveys, we can't deny that there's only a certain slice of the population participating in kind of organized digital processes that depends on certain demographics, access to the internet, or just access to electricity for that matter, right? If you have a few hours to charge your phone, do you really want to engage in a political conversation or just share information with your family members? And that's, I think, where kind of, we need to think about a triangulation of information, where, again, simple surveys that would at least give us some statistical relevance, right? Some idea of what the population at large in a certain place really thinks, combined with more sophisticated AI tools, gives us a greater sense for where opportunities might lie that we haven't explored yet as peat makers. So, as Johanna put it earlier, kind of in a complementary manner, with a clear eye on kind of the design choices, I think that's the way of how one could go about this.
And just as a segue to Johanna, we received in the chat a similar question around how do we fix this disconnect, between. Actually, the question is, how is the mediation and policy community addressing this disconnect between technological potential and political reality? Martin answered partially, but do you also have an input on that, or Martin, you want to say something more about this?
I mean, look, I think this conversation today is trying to kind of bridge that disconnect. There are different efforts where tech companies are approached, large ones and smaller ones, to make licenses available or to be engaged in a larger AI governance conversation. If you look at the process that regional and international organizations are hosting that always includes players from all sides, both from the public sector, from the private sector, and the mix in between. So I think the important part is to spell out the challenges, to be honest about those, right, and not get trapped in the AI for good illusion, because there's nothing for free, right? There's nothing for free, but likewise, there's a lot to gain, and what's required, I think, is like build more prototypes, test out more applications, then be mindful about the guardrails that are needed, as we've done with the CMI principles for AI use in peacemaking.
Jana?
If I may also jump into this question, also very poignant one around, at the same time as this technological change is happening, we also have a fundamental shift in what mediation looks like. We are moving towards much more transactional mediation, often much more narrow processes, in no longer so these kind of elaborate, more comprehensive peace agreements. And I think from that perspective, I would say that the promise of digital technologies may not be so much about fundamentally altering the highest level of political processes, but also contributing to this kind of more national peace ecosystems that are kind of the sustaining layer underneath of translating a more of a high level outcome into a longer term sustainable peace on the ground. And there's a number of often political questions, economic questions that still need to be tackled at the national level. And it is the deliberative technology that can really broaden participation and inclusivity around those questions. And maybe a small note also what Martin says, I absolutely agree that we have to be very realistic about the limitations of reaching a certain segment of population via digital means. Having said that, I think that what do we compare to that? Do we compare it to the perfect, or do we compare it to what many of these conversations around peace and security have been in the past? And I, having worked on inclusion for the past 2 decades, I still that there is an opportunities that we are missing out if we are not harnessing technology in responsible ways. So, and maybe if we are kind of coming to the final round, I can take just I think greatest takeaways would be to kind of stay away from this black and white AI all good, AI all bad. I think it's preventing the field from really having a thoughtful and responsible conversation and praxis around using technology to advance our work. I think there's much more that we can do in this field, and it's the risks that are kind of, rightfully so, we're taking them seriously, but should not prevent us from responsible practice and application. Thank you.
If you want to, well, I mean, since Ioana started with the final round, I don't know, Dr. John Truby, if we can start with this final round. Raphael, you can be next. You know, how do we? I would say, like, what do we leave our audience with? Like, what practical takeaway in terms of translating standards and frameworks, also from your standpoint, into actual practical work in peacemaking practice. So what would be that, let's say, the top suggestion as an advisor in this field?
And before you start, if you can just each person answer like very concisely, because I'm being told we're almost out of time, and Singapore takes timekeeping very seriously. So sorry about that. Thank you.
Okay, so real quickly, just going back, there's something I wanted to add to the discussion earlier, which is about data sovereignty, that I think it's important to have localized AI. And this works if you have kind of a peace process that's within one country. But when you have kind of like 2 countries, for example, and you need to have a localized AI, data sovereignty doesn't, AI sovereignty doesn't work the same way. So I think what we need to have is AI sovereignty for non-governmental organizations, for the UN, for example, to be able to kind of create this. And I think that leads me to my closing statement as well, which is that there needs to be, we need to do more with regards to international law to actually say something and create frameworks for the use of AI, in the peace process. And it's not enough that we actually relegate this to the parties to kind of figure this out on their own. We should actually create organizations and frameworks and processes for actually deploying AI into the peace processes. Thank you.
I'm just gonna end with some advertisement. One for CMI's website. CMI just put together some resources. So if you're out there interested in AI and peacemaking, check out the CMI website. Some advertisement on the Data for Peace conference that is coming up early June. CMI and others are supporting that. So if this is a new field to you, there's a conference happening in a hybrid format, online and in person, where you can learn more. And then last, a special issue Michaela and I and others have done with the Data and Policy Journal last year that looks at data for peace in particular. So a few resources. And again, thanks so much for having us.
Johanna, any final thoughts? No. Okay. Well, perfect. Well, we're finishing just on time. Thank you so much to everybody, and I'm astounded by how many people have actually joined and stayed all the way to the end. We've had over 550 people watching all the way through. So thank you to everyone who's joined. Michelle, thank you for co-hosting and co-moderating this with me. To all the speakers, Samuel, Martin, Raphael, Johanna, really, really wonderful. I think we could talk so much more about this. We may have to plan further discussion. These reflections as well by the audience have been very useful, and there's a lot to unpack. I would love to. I've got to thank. I really have to thank our events team who've been fantastic in putting this together. We have a great events team at CAL, Jerry, our communications team, and to Adol, who's been coordinating this extremely efficiently behind the scenes. So on behalf of CIL, UNESCO Chair on AI, Law and Sustainability, the ILA, and National University of Singapore, thank you from the bottom of my heart for joining this. We will be posting this whole video online once it's ready, and we'll be publishing a post-report event for anyone who's interested. Michelle, any final remarks or thank yous?
Big thank you, and let's continue the conversation. I think we need more and more of this. Thank you so much.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. Wish everyone a great rest of the day. This has been wonderful. Take care.